the Greek and Roman culture first, the Greco-Roman culture. I thought I would show you how, what the people were exposed to. So it starts off, and I thought, how do you organize this? And I thought, all right, let's just talk about the people to start with. And the people in the Roman Greek Empire had social rankings. We have social rankings in the United States, but they're not labeled so much. They're, you know, if you go to India, they're very, very labeled. If you are born in this one, you can't ever enter this one. You know, it just won't happen. But so they had a little bit of social ranking, and they started off with the aristocracy. And the aristocracy was the high people, and they were the wealthy people, and they generally had two kinds. They had the senatorial, which is the aristocracy. And they had the senatorial class. Now, the senatorial class is the top-notch class. They are the class that run the empire. They are in the Senate of Rome. They are the big, top guys there is. And the next class down is called the equestrian class. And the equestrian class means you could ride a horse. Now, that means nothing to us, but to them, it means you were wealthy enough to have a horse. So that would be like, okay, this is the Mercedes-Benz class, this is the high-end class, this is the high culture class, and those two classes are primarily the ones that they chose their governors from. The governors for the different provinces came from one of these two classes. Have you ever read through and wondered why are some of them called procreators? Now I can't say that. Okay, you've got, I just lost all of it. You've got the governors, you've got the legates, you've got the, have you noticed that there's all kinds of different titles for like things like that? You've got, I lost them all. Anyway, when I think of them, I'll tell you. Part of those titles mean that part of it's rank, who's higher than who, you know, as these titles go down. And part of it is, are you from the senatorial class, or are you from the equestrian class? So some of that, because I sat there for a couple hours one day just going through these titles. I go, okay, who's in charge of who? Who's over who? And then they have them all mixed up. I go, all right, this isn't making any sense. And I realized that they got their titles from where they came from, which class they came from. So there's things like that. Procreator. No? Still can't get it. Okay. Anyway. Tell me what Herod's called, and he's the king. Tell me what Pilate's called. He's called governor. What else? That's our term. They had another term. I'll get to it. All right. Okay, so then there was also the middle class. That's the next one down. The middle class during this time, during the first century of the Roman Empire, was starting to diminish in numbers. And the reason is because the upper class, if the middle class had any trouble and financial trouble whatsoever, the upper class just bought their land and took over. So the middle class would become lower class. So we have this huge break between upper class and lower class with only a few middle class in the middle. And then as you get to the lower classes, you have just your plain old poor people. They were called plebes, P-L-E-B-S, plebes. And there was no government social services, okay, or subsidies. You could not go to the government and get food stamps, which they don't do anymore, but they call them something else now, but you couldn't get that. You were just plain old poor. You notice how many times you hear stories of the guys sitting on the steps by the temple or by the gates begging? That's what poor people could do. They couldn't go and get their social check or whatever. They didn't have that. And then you have your next class down, and your next class below that is a little bit better off actually than the plebes, and those were the slaves. And the reason the slaves were a little bit better off than the plebes is because the slaves at least had food, shelter, and clothing. All right? They weren't necessarily treated well. At the time of the first century, it is estimated that over 50% of the entire population of the Roman Empire was slaves. Okay? One of the reasons that the middle class did not do so well is because in business, the upper class ran their businesses and their farms and their huge estates with slaves, which means the competition was very hard for the middle class to keep up with that kind of cost. So that was that. Some of the slaves had good owners, and they actually were recompensed for some of their stuff, and they got to then save up their money and buy their freedom. They were called freedmen. So if you read that, and there's actually verses in the Bible about freedmen, they are previous slaves that were able to save up money and buy their freedom. And there's a couple stories like that where one guy is talking to Paul, and he says, well, I bought my citizenship in Rome, and Paul goes, no, well, I was actually born a citizen. Do you know that? Yeah, so that refers to that. So sometimes, a lot of times the slaves were not taught well, were not treated well, and they were just they had to do all kinds of things they were probably deceptive. They had to do all kinds of things to get stuff because they weren't treated well. So there's that part of society. And then there's one other part of society, and that's the criminals. And there are criminals around, and they've always got to do that. So if you think about it, it sounds exactly like life today. It has different titles, and we don't necessarily have slaves, but for the most part, it sounds like life today. And how many of the big financial companies put out the little stores because you can't compete with the big stores, So that's why there's so much emphasis in Ambler County to shop local instead of buying everything at Amazon, So that's the same kind of situation, so there's nothing new under the sun. I'm going to go through these kind of quick because I have a ton. So we're going to jump to science, architecture, and arts. And I'm going to start with the architecture. They were really good at building roads. The Roman Empire was incredibly good at building roads. Some of those roads still exist. Now, I drive down Sutter Creek Volcano Road, and it is mended every year, and it is still awful. It really is. And the fact that they have roads that are over 2,000 years old that are still in really good condition is something for the Romans' architecture. They built them with several layers of rock, sediment, plaster, whatever that they put on, and then they arched it slightly so that the water would run off the road. So it's pretty good. They weren't super wide. They didn't have 6-lane roads, They would just have room for 2 horses and 2 chariots to go by or whatever. So, but there's tons of those, and they're still around all over the place. They also built a lot of aqueducts. We got to see one of these when we were there, and that's a large thing with these arches under it, and it just looks like a whole bunch of arches with a thing across the top, and the water ran through the top, and that's how you got water from one location to another. And I was watching on some show on TV one time where they showed how the Romans figured out how to get water up over a hill by using force of gravity and physics. And I thought that is just fascinating that they could do that. So they did a lot of that. They had great temples as far as their building goes, and they were the 7 wonders of the world. There were lots of these things. Some of them are still standing, some of them are not. So they built the Colosseum, stuff like that. One of the theaters, this page that you have, that right there is the theater at Ephesus, and it seats 45,000.
Oh.
I know, and they have no microphone system. So here's the most crazy thing. I'm up at the very top of one of those things in Ephesus, and Martha and a friend are down at the bottom in the center on the quote stage, right? They start to sing. It is so clear. I can hear it as if I'm this close. The acoustics are amazing. I was like, I just wanted to, we had to get up and leave because the tour is constantly going like this, and you go, I just want to sit here for a while and listen to it. But anyway, so so they did great with their buildings. Their art was mostly statues or carvings on walls. So they did that. They didn't have painting, so to speak, as much. They did statues. And if you look at some of those, they are very well carved. The features are very well done and whatnot. They had a lot of different kinds of musical instruments, but primarily they used stringed instruments and flutes. And when they had their big events or when they had their big meals, they would entertain with that. So a lot of this culture, you go, wow, this just kind of sounds like today. We don't have, theaters, these theaters, but we have theaters, just so much is similar. The drama became rather degenerate, just saying that when they had their stage shows and they had their tragedies and their comedies and whatnot, they ended up being rather degenerate, and they sort of appealed to that part of human nature, and that's why people went there. When they went to the arena, that was even worse because that was an appeal to their desire for bloodthirstiness and their desire for brutality, and they would have, they would have these competitions between the wild animal and the gladiator to see who would win. And then when that person won, they had a competition between the final gladiator on this side and the final gladiator on this side, and they would see who would win. And the people went berserk over the excitement of watching this ordeal, which I'm really glad we don't have that publicly in our culture at the moment. So thank God for that. That was their entertainment. They also had the Olympic Games, and they did that. That was mostly track and field type stuff and boxing type stuff. There wasn't any gymnastics going on. There wasn't swimming going on. There wasn't all that other stuff going on. It was just that part of it. Their science. Their mathematics was rather advanced. They already had the Pythagorean theorem, and they already knew that. You guys remember what that is from algebra? No? I knew you wouldn't, so I had to go check it out. It's a triangle. See, the girls know. It's a triangle, and you go a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So if you take this side of the triangle, and that's a squared, and you take this side, it's just b, whatever that distance is. You square both of this and this, add it together, you can find the length of this.
You really needed that.
So that is the Pythagorean theorem. That was developed probably while the Israelites were in Babylon in captivity. Can you imagine that? Yeah, that was just, I thought, I always knew it was like way back there, but to say, while they were in captivity, some great guys figuring this out, that just sort of like connected with me on that. They were really good they were into calculus. They had calculus already. They had the astronomy figured out. Astrology, excuse me, I'm going to use the right word, whichever on this. I get those two mixed up. They had that. They knew how to figure out the ratio between the circumference of a circle and the area of a circle. So they had a lot of mathematics figured out, a lot of geometry. And that led into physics. And because they had the physics, they could actually build these huge buildings because they knew how to use the, the levers and the things that caused that to do. They also could build great things of engines of war where they could, that's what they call the things that sort of break the catapults and whatnot, and how you could climb over a city wall and how you could attack on the other side of the walls. That was in their science. They also had geography. They had maps of everywhere, fairly accurate maps, mostly, and you could at least look at it and recognize what you're looking at. And so they had that. That was already done. We're talking about prior to the birth of Christ, okay? Medicine. They had all kinds of medicine. They already knew surgery. They already knew how to do a cesarean section. They already knew how to, I don't know that they could replace parts with different parts, but they knew how to get in and fix that. They had, I don't think I can say it right, Asclepius? Is that how you say that guy's name? The guy who did the cross with the snake around it? Yeah, okay, that started back then, and that was the beginning of medicine. By the time we get to here, they have our time, what we're talking about, we have about 600 different medicinal things made from plants that they knew. So when the lady who has the issue of blood goes to the doctor, there's actually someone who at that time knows what they're doing, and yet they still couldn't solve her problem. So I just kind of felt like, oh, he was telling him to go, I just never put a whole lot of stock into how much that doctor might know. The other thing I thought was interesting is that Tarsus, where Paul is from, is one of the leading universities for medicine in the area, along with Alexandria and a couple others. So that was interesting to me that they did that. Okay, so their languages. They spoke Latin on the, I always have to think backwards, on the western side of the entire empire is mostly Latin, okay? On the eastern side of the entire empire is mostly Greek. Now, if you have something that's high literature or whatever, and it's over here, it's going to be in Greek. If you have something that's high in government authorities and whatnot, that's over here, it's going to be in Latin, okay? But for people talking, mostly Latin, mostly Greek. The other languages that were really common were Aramaic. Aramaic was spoken by the Jewish people, by the average Jewish people. By the time, there's still Hebrew, but only the scholars speak Hebrew. The Jewish scholars, like the rabbis and those guys, speak Hebrew. Hebrew went out of normal conversation between just, you and I at home, whatever, around the time of Ezra. And Ezra is before Malachi. So for 400 years now, we have not spoken Hebrew as common language in your homes. We've spoken Aramaic. I always, in my brain, forever got that mixed up with Arabic. That's an entirely different language. So Aramaic and Arabic are not the same thing, right? Just because in my brain I didn't disassociate those two. Aramaic is like a common language of Hebrew. You take Hebrew and you make it just, everyday common language, and you make it Aramaic. When Jesus was on the cross, he had it up there in Latin. Why would he have it in Latin way over here on the eastern side? Because they had the Roman authorities there. He had it up there in Greek because that was the language of almost all people, and he had it up there in Aramaic. It might have been Hebrew, but I'm guessing, I have to check that detail, I'm pretty sure it's Aramaic. So he had that up there in those three languages. Yes?
So how is this? Are you finding this information from the Old Testament or from scholars that's researched? I mean, how do you know those signs were there? I can't
That sign is, the sign on the cross
Yeah.
is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay.
Okay, the rest of this stuff is like, I studied with two primary guys who just did this huge research on New Testament history. And one is F.F. Bruce, and the other one was Tenney. I'm trying to think of what his first name is. And the guy who's Tenney was one of the, I actually took I took a class at San Jose Bible College when I was 18, and the professor taught New Testament survey with this book by Tenney, and it turned out that that professor became one of the lead guys at, I've got too many names in my head, what's the Christian college that,
William Jessup or?
yeah, William Jessup, yeah. And when that guy was speaking here from William Jessup, I asked him about this, and he said, oh, yeah, it's the same guy. That was the first class he ever taught, and I got to sit in that. So this is where I got this information. A lot of the other stuff came from, I have a series on Jewish culture history that has taken me forever to get through, because you really want to sleep through this series. It goes on and on. And then as far as dates and facts, I've just checked the internet. So that's where I've gotten a lot of this from. So, yeah. So, they also had all the other languages. Each different province has its own language. So like in Egypt, they speak Egyptian, and all these different languages, of which we will find out in Acts chapter 2, when the Holy Spirit comes and these people start speaking in their own languages. What shocks them is that Peter and the people didn't go out there and speak in Greek. Everybody would have understood that. They spoke in their home dialects, and it's more than just each language, it's each dialect. Like in the as I looked up the word, it's like in the United States. If you hear someone speaking from Boston, they do not sound like someone speaking from Alabama. So if you went to a place and all of a sudden you could speak English like you were from Boston, the Boston people would really hone in and pay attention. But if you spoke it like you were from Alabama, those people would really hone in and pay attention. If you just spoke plain English, they would all hear, but it wouldn't catch their attention like that. So that's what happened on the day of Pentecost. So that's really cool so you have to realize almost everybody was bilingual or trilingual, which makes me feel really dumb, because I can't do that. So, so they were very, very well educated in the different languages. Yeah. All right. Speaking of education, let's go to education. It was not a law that kids had to go to school. So there is no official, all kids go to school. That was not a law. The kids who got to go to school were the kids of people wealthy enough to pay for their way to school. Or if they were in the Roman or Greek hierarchy and they had slaves, many of those slaves were purchased or gotten through military conquest. So if you go in and you have a military conquest and you take out this city and whatever, you take their slaves, you have doctors who are slaves, you have very educated teachers who are slaves, you have all these high-ranking people who are slaves, and you bring them in and you set them up as a tutor over your children. So your children get this slave tutor who's not just an uneducated person. He's very, very smart. And in Galatians, God compares that to us as being under the law as a tutor, and now we're grown up. Okay, so that's coming up in the book of Galatians, that illustration is used. They had, I already told you how they sat around. Well, that was in the synagogue, so excuse me for that. They learned like this. for those of you who just got out of school, just so you love this, or those of you who teach, they learn by constant repetition. So school was, I'll say it, you say it. Say it again, say it again, say it again, say it again, say it again. Constant repetition. That's how they learned. That's what school was like. There were no charts on walls, there were no blackboards, there were no fun things. It didn't look, the room was cold. Actually had that written out there, the room was cold. Endless and long memorizations. That's what, like if you were in a Greek school, you may have to memorize Plato. Oh, how fun at age 7. Makes everybody really want to go to school. Yeah, they did have corporal punishment. That was part of the thing. And they did reading, writing, arithmetic, and they learned the Greek and Latin poets. And they also would learn about the gods. So that's school for the children of Rome and Greece. They probably started going to school around age 6 or 7. By the time they reach 12 or 13, around in that area, if they're advanced and they're really smart and they're doing a lot, they're sent off to university at age 13. Okay, so when Paul says that he was sent to university, that's what happened to him. If they weren't, they were probably apprenticed to someone for a trade. That's what happened. So childhood was shorter. And teenage years was probably non-existent.
Debbie, I have a question. I'm trying to picture Paul, who was in a higher category, but he was Jewish.
I'll get to how did the Jewish people live in the Greek.
Yes.
Yes, I'll get to that. I'm trying to lay out what the Greek was, and then I'll take our Jewish people and put them in there. Yeah, so good question though. It's in there. The economy was mostly either agriculture, and even the high-ranking people had huge estates with their agriculture, and which is why they were so wealthy. And they had slave labor, whereas the middle class, if they had an estate, didn't necessarily have slave labor. So that was why the competition was so difficult. Industry, they had a lot of that. They had things made by hand. They did not have, to my knowledge, they did not have assembly line yet. Maybe they did to some extent, but not officially. It wasn't like, when Ford decided how to put together the assembly line to build a car, which was a huge, huge thing right then. So they had a lot of small shops, and they had a lot of handmade stuff. That was pretty much that. Their money was a denarius, and that is a coin, and it's a day's wage. So if you worked all day long, you got one of these. So you can imagine, the only way you can put a value on this is imagine, what does a man make in a day? A working man, not a banker, but what does a working man make in a day? If he makes $100 in a day, which is kind of low, let's say he makes $100 in a day, then that's the value of a denarius. Okay, back then it was worth 17 cents. And sometimes it was called a penny. Okay, or a shilling, depending on whether or not you're reading the Bible in England or not. Yeah, so if you had 40 of these, you had an Arius, which was a gold one. That's like a talent. Okay, so when the story of the landowner who gives his slaves the talents, and they're supposed to, the talents are not, oh, I have this skill. The talents are money. They're called a talent. So many cities minted their own coins. So because you had coins minted from different places, when you traveled, the money changers made a lot of money. That was a business there. Banks were privately owned, and they were not supported by the government. So if a bank failed, you failed with it. Right? And the Jews would not mint coins with any faces on them, because that violates the second commandment of the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not create any graven images. So they would not put a face on a coin. So when they have this big argument in the temple and Jesus says, hand me that coin, he's picking up a Roman or a Greek coin, because there is no Jewish coin. He goes, whose face is on this coin? It wouldn't be a Roman, it wouldn't be a Jewish coin. So I'm not even sure the Jews made coins. Maybe they did and I missed that detail. So, they also did not put, just while I'm on the no image thing, I love rabbit trails. I do them all the time. Okay, so you could not bring a flag of the empire into Jerusalem because the flag had a picture of the emperor on it. And so one time there's this huge riot. Herod tries to bring in the flags and set them up around the temple. And the riot is unreal. What happens, with the people, because they've got to get those down. Tons of them are killed. And one of the things that he finally gets the Sadducees to do, because the Sadducees are willing to accommodate the leader so that they can stay in their high positions, is to give allegiance to the emperor. And that's how, one of the ways Herod secured his position. But, and so if they have to give allegiance to the emperor, that's like having a god before me. So that's how they interpreted that rule. So I was amazed at how many riots took place in Jerusalem. Big, huge riots. 2,000 men are crucified on the roads because there's a riot here and there everywhere. It was, yeah. And whenever Pilate started to lose control, the guy from Syria, the legate from Syria, had to come in and take over, because that's how the rules were back then, which is one reason why Pilate gave in to Jesus' crucifixion, because the riot was starting, and he had already had a riot within the last couple of years, or 5 years, or whatever. His position as procreator, I'm sure that's the word, I'm losing it, was in jeopardy. So there's that. The religions, this is a big one. They had the Pantheon with all the gods. I mean, I don't even know how many gods there are. There's like so many gods, I can't figure out how many gods there are. I do know that when the Greeks and Romans came together, they lined up their gods. So like Zeus became Jupiter. They're the same god, two different names. So if you're talking about Zeus, you're also talking about Jupiter. So then Juno became Hera. Neptune and Poseidon are the same one. Pluto and Hades are the god of the underworld, same one. Most of these gods were like, the best way I can describe them is they're like humans with really awful attitudes and selfishness, and they're fighting each other and arguing each other, and it's like to me, that's the story of the gods. If you've ever read Greek mythology and whatnot, it's just like berserk and yeah. So that's there. So they had a lot of immoralities in the stories of the gods. They had a lot of squabbles with each other. They had a lot of things where they were in competition with each other, the gods. And to worship this it doesn't make sense to me, even from the viewpoint of not having anything else to worship. That still doesn't make any sense to me. Each city or province had their own set of gods. So there was the gods, and then each one had their favorite set of gods. Like, okay, these are our gods. And so in Ephesus, it was Artemis. And in Corinth, it's Aphrodite. And their worship of these gods was very immoral. That's how they did their worship. I'm just gonna leave it like that. And yeah. So They did the ritual sacrifices. They did not do their sacrifice to try to gain any kind of personal relationship with their God. That was not an idea you knew. You would not become, your God didn't care about you. What you wanted was your God to protect your city. It's all about protection. So when the city got taken by an enemy and you lost, your question was, well, is my God not strong enough? Or did he just not care? And that was often what went through their heads. So there was that. You got no personal comfort from your gods. It wasn't a personal thing at all. So if you're having really hard times and you needed help, you wouldn't necessarily go to the God personally. This was sort of, as a matter of fact, it was almost a patriotic, the city worships the God protects the city. Okay, it's like that. That's how that was done. Emperor worship, he was just added to the gods. So when Julius Caesar died or was assassinated, the Senate made him, at his death, made him a god. So they added Deus to his name, Julius Deus. Deus means God. All right? When Augustus died, he was made a god. When Tiberius died, he was made a god. Caligula, who's next, thought he was a god, which changed the way he dealt with his empire because the other ones were made gods after they died. He thinks he's a god, and he's going to do stuff that we'll learn about. Some of the names they added was Epiphanes. You already heard that. So you would take the name and you would add one to it. Epiphanes means manifest God, which is like God incarnate. So Antiochus got Epiphanes. One of them got Kyrios. Kyrios is the word for Lord. Our Lord Jesus Christ. Let's see, Savior. This one is Kyrios. That was given to one of the emperors. So he got that, meaning he's God. One of them got Soter, Savior. This all happens right around Jesus. This happened actually before Jesus was born. This happened before Jesus was born. So these words were being tossed around to the emperors before Jesus Christ, they were applied to Jesus Christ. This one is his name. This one means Messiah, because it means anointed one. And the word Messiah in Hebrew means anointed one. And this word in Greek means anointed one. Christos means anointed one. Even Jesus itself means Savior. So I'm thinking, wow, how well did Satan attack the titles of Jesus Christ? You know, by diminishing them with the gods. So that was like that. Nero and Domitian, when we get to them, are the ones who did persecution in the time of the first century. I'll get into that more when we get to what happened with Nero and Domitian. The Christians who refused to worship the gods were called atheists. Then I just thought that's funny. So they're called atheists because they will only worship one God and they will not worship the other gods. And so they are atheists. If you did make an offering to the gods, it went to the state treasury. Just saying. So then there was also something they called, we've covered the Pantheon and the Emperor. There was also something called the mystery religions. The mystery religions were when they tried to come up with this really spiritual thing that was a personal thing with the gods. And you had to go through all kinds of rituals and mystery things, and that were not, you couldn't tell anybody about them unless they joined the group. And so there was that. There was the occult. The occult is worshiping the spirits and the demons and all that, and they had their magic spells and they had their books. And you know, in Ephesus, they burned all the magic books. That was getting rid of the occult in Ephesus. And there was a lot of that. They also have, they did a lot with augury, which is cutting up the sacrificed animal and reading the entrails to figure out what your future was.
Wow.
So they would take out the liver and the different parts and splatter it down, and how it splattered told you what was your future, so your fortune telling. Yeah, that was a little gross. They also from Babylon they got the horoscopes for the stars and things like that. Okay, so I'm going to quickly do the philosophies, and then I think we're done for this. We'll go through it real quick. The philosophies are the Greek smart guys who lived between about 400 BC and 100 BC and time of Christ. So these are between the testaments. Most of them anyway. Some of them are before that. And there's Platoism. I'll just give you a clue. One of them says that mostly they say logic is all there is, and reason is all there is, and you can figure it out by experience. This is Platonism, and there are no gods. That's just absurd, and there is no spiritual realm whatsoever. This is it right here. Okay, that's one viewpoint. The other viewpoint is another one called, Gnosticism is a lead-off of Platonism, and we will have to deal with Gnosticism because that's what the book of 1 John deals with, Gnosticism, so we will deal with that, but I'll get to that when we get there. Epicureanism is all physical, and if it's all physical and there's no spiritual realm, and then it doesn't matter what you do. You do whatever you want. Okay, so that was one of them. Stoicism, there's that one. It's a little different. If you want all the details, I got it all written out on these here. One of them, Stoicism, said that the universe was created by an atom that collided with another atom and then split off like this. And eventually, we got the universe. I'm going, whoa, did evolution get taken from that one, Because it's very much like that. And one of them said that, how was the Epicureanism? One of them was no purpose, there's no design, there's no absolute good, all is relative. The highest good is pleasure. Pleasure is no pain. That's the definition of pleasure. So when you make your decisions, make sure you don't have consequences that cause pain. So a lot of them wouldn't get drunk because being drunk has consequences that have pain. So there's some level of morality in that. But for the most part, it was just really weird. When we get after the break, I'm going to show you a story of a Jewish guy who bought into this and how it affected his thinking. Because that's the reason I'm telling you all this. Because this is the culture most of the entire Jewish world was dumped into. Okay? So you go, why are we even hearing, who cares, right? This is the culture they were dumped into. And if our family was dumped into a culture like this and 400 years of generations went by, what would that generation look like? Okay, that's the people that Jesus sends the disciples to go present the gospel to. It's these people here. Okay? So to me, it just changed the whole story of what did it look like to go to these people and present the gospel to them? And how much does that look just like today? So it was very encouraging because this is the fullness of times. This is the time God chose to bring the gospel into it. But okay, well, if they can do it, so can we. Alrighty, you take a break and we'll come back and we'll think about Jewish culture. How we are last year. I'm sorry. Oh, I can go. Okay. We're gonna do the Jewish culture now and what's going on with them. I just thought I'd start with what their theology was. We kind of know this, but they believe in one God, obviously. They took the Shema as their statement. The Shema is Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And that would be their, I don't know, Pledge of Allegiance, so to speak, or what you want to call that. That was the statement that they've all said, and little kids learn from tiny up. It sounds like this in Hebrew: Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And I can only quote 2 verses in Hebrew out of the whole Old Testament, and that's one of them. So that's that one. It says, and the next part of it is, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And later, when Jesus is asked what's the great commandment, he doesn't go to the first of the 10 commandments. He goes to the one that's their national, the one that they say constantly. I thought that's interesting, that he takes them to where their home, their home in their brain is where they go. Yeah. So that's kind of cool. They believe he's transcendent. They believe he's all powerful. They believe he's a father. They believe that they are the sons of Yahweh. That's all documented in the Old Testament that they have that. The law to them was a direct revelation from God. It's not like the Epicureanism where they think it out, or the Stoics or the Greek philosophers. So to them, their law, their religion, which is way different from everybody else in this entire empire, has credit because it is directly from God. So they are often that's one reason why they will fight for it so much more. And for very good reason. And it was to be strictly obeyed. It was the moral law and the ceremonial law, like they say, do not steal and wash your hands this way. Okay, ceremonial law and moral law were combined on an equal level. So if you washed your hands incorrectly, it was like breaking these laws. Do you notice they said to Jesus, how come you don't wash like this? How come you guys don't fast like this? So they were accusing him. It's all the same labor, which I didn't get. I think, why are you being so picky? Or for something so minor, but they did not have major rules and minor rules. They're all at the same level. So that answers a lot of questions as you read through the Gospels. They have a strong expectation of Messiah, but their Messiah is not what we see as Messiah. Their Messiah is the son of David coming in on a white horse with an army, conquering the Romans and getting them out of there and setting up a kingdom. So anybody who falls short of that is not Messiah. Okay? That's how they see that. There's a lot of people who between the Hasmoneans and the birth of Christ that tried this. They said, I'm the Messiah. There's a guy named Judas from Galilee who was the Messiah. And he had a group of 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers out in the wilderness, and they come charging in on Jerusalem after King Herod dies, but before the 3 sons I think I told you all this last week, before the three sons take over, because they're off in Rome getting verified, and they wreak havoc, and they lose, and the guy from, the head legate from Syria has to come in and put down the rebellion, and they are taken out, and all of them are crucified. Okay? So that's how and after Jesus, just to let you know, there's at least 2, maybe 3 guys with the name of Jesus who claim to be Messiah, who come in and do the same kind of thing. And this is in the years following Jesus. So there's a whole lot of Messiahs. So they get to the point where if your Messiah isn't living up to your standards of Messiah, he's not Messiah. That's kind of what happened there. Another thing that happened, that's just a real quick summary of their belief system. The rest of that is we would find in the Old Testament and around there. The synagogue got started during this time. Actually, the synagogue is really interesting. It got started while they were in Babylon. Because you see, their whole system of worship is go to the temple and make sacrifices. They can't go to the temple. They can't make sacrifices. One thing that they have left are their scriptures. And so what they do is they get groups to try to maintain their Jewish identity and their faith, just to stay who they are. They make groups in each little town, and they call it a synagogue. Synagogue means assembly. That's what that word, so even in the New Testament, when you see the word assembly, and you look at the Greek, it's synagogue, it's a synagogue. Okay, I just thought that was interesting. So you had to have 10 men to create a synagogue. And then one of them was going to be the rabbi. If they didn't have a priest, like let's say you're in a little village and you don't have an official priest from the priestly line, you just got whoever knew the most. He became the rabbi, and he became the teacher of the synagogue. Then you have another guy who is the administrator of the synagogue, and he would stand there at 5 o'clock on Friday night and blow the shofar saying, Sabbath is about to start, because it starts at 6 on Friday night, right? And then he would blow it at 6:01 on Saturday saying, okay, it's over, and that way you had Sabbath identified. He kept track of the scrolls, he kept them in the box. Every synagogue had a platform. It had a box that you kept the scrolls in. It had lights around. It had benches. It was kind of a semicircle, that type of thing. Kind of looks like a church. Looks just like the churches kind of now. And we have our rounds go the other direction, but So they said that's how the synagogue worked, and that got started back in Babylon. And they carried that through. So when they came back, when the people came back, when Cyrus the Great sent the decree that you could go back, there's like 2 or 3 million Jews out there. 40,000 go back. That's not very many. That's how many go back to Jerusalem. So the rest of these are all around. And they have all their sin. That's why Esther is still way out in Persia after they go back. That's why Nehemiah is still way out in Persia, because they have all this. But they want to maintain their Jewish identity as much as they can and their faith. So they create the synagogues. Even after the temple is rebuilt, the whole idea of the synagogue stays. And so even in Jerusalem, there were synagogues. We'll find that out in Acts. There'll be a synagogue that Stephen speaks in Acts. So it's interesting how they do this. And that became a really huge piece in maintaining who the Jewish people were, was the synagogue. And probably still to this day. That's probably a thing. Let's see how they cover all that. They would all say the Shema. That's how the synagogue worship would go like this. You would walk in and they would all say that creed I just told you. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. They would all say that. And then they would have a barakat. Barakat means blessing. And they would have a certain blessing that was memorized that they would all say. Blessing. And then they would say, and it would go like this something, and you might have heard it. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then the next one would be, blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who provides the fruit of the vine. And then they would have their food or their drink or whatever. That's how they did Passover, and they drank the cup of Passover. So they say, blessed are you, O Lord, our God, who provides the bread from the earth. And then they would eat the bread. Okay? So that would be how they would say that. It was all very kind of ritualistic, but it was meant to mean something like that. They had a portion of scripture that was read. This is still the outline of synagogue to this day, to my knowledge. They would start with, the first portion would be out of Genesis through Deuteronomy, out of the Torah. And that is what they would read first. And then most synagogues had for a second portion that was read out of the prophets. And then after they read the thing, then the rabbi would come up and he would sit down and then teach the people what that prophet meant. Okay, so you guys remember what happened in Nazareth? They invite Jesus up and they read a portion, and then it says he sits down and he just explains why that portion, which was Isaiah 61, applied to him. So he's following actual, which I thought was really neat, that it's following this pattern and that it's in the story like that. They would close with a rabbi saying a prayer. And if you notice, Jesus went to synagogue, and so did the disciples, and so did Paul. He starts all of his missions in each different town in the synagogue. So this is how that's how they reach the people. The schooling took place in the synagogue too. So they also did not have required schooling, although in the Talmud, which is a book of explanations on what the oral law is, which was the traditions passed down, that they said one guy said that this was his expectation, that every boy, 6 or 7, should go to Torah school. And when they did, they sat around in a circle, like I showed you, like I told you, and they did not memorize the Greek philosophies. What they memorized was Torah, the books. One person said that a child had to memorize the entire Torah. Do you realize, could you memorize Genesis 1:1 to Deuteronomy? There's 50 chapters in Genesis. There's 40 in Exodus. There's like, what, 30, 27, 28, 39, something in Leviticus, I'm not sure. There's like 38 in Numbers, and there's 32 in Deuteronomy. And they were supposed to have Torah memorized. Wow. And that's not counting what they had to memorize from the prophets and from the books of poetry and whatnot, the Psalms and things. They had to memorize, and we think teaching our kids to memorize 5 verses is a big deal, right? Yeah, so their school was also it's very much following the same pattern as the Greek schools. It's just that their content was different. Their content was Torah. I don't know for sure that they had to memorize the entire thing. I didn't have that verified by more than one source, so I can't tell you. I try to get my information verified by more than one source, but I did not know.
Some of that memorization, I think, is still required. I have a niece who is going to do her bat mitzvah next month, and I thought she said she had to memorize the Torah.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. It's just, yeah, yeah, amazing how much. I did hear of this one guy who was a rabbi who had the entire Old Testament memorized and did not believe in Jesus. And I'm thinking to myself, how did you accomplish that? Yeah,
Memorize the words, but I didn't go as far.
I know, but he had to memorize Isaiah 53. Okay, so they had the same kind of curriculum, reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. And they did the same thing. They also learned the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are like explanation books for Torah, written way back then. Okay, so it's a lot. It's just a lot. They studied a lot, those children. So when you hear them say, oh, those unlearned guys from Galilee who went to Torah school. Yeah, it's different definition of unlearned. Yeah, girls didn't get to go to school. They did not learn this stuff. In their home, if their dad wanted to teach them, their dad could, but they did not officially go to school. Girls did not learn. Girls' job was to learn how to run a house and to everything from spinning to weaving to dyeing cloth to baking to grinding wheat to, I mean, so much more than girls have to learn today because we just go buy our flour pre-ground, you know, stuff like that. They probably had to learn how to thresh it, everything. So they had a lot to learn too, but they learned it inside their home. They lived in a, well, before I go where they lived, when the boy reached 13, he also needed to have a vocation. And even the ones who went off to university also had to have a vocation, because Paul was from a university and also a tent maker. So he has a backup thing. The disciples were fishermen. That means that they actually became apprenticed under their father. How do you become a really, not just go fishing and have fun, how do you have a business of fishing? And the Zebedees had all kinds of people working under them, lots of other ships and things, so they had a fishing business, so to speak. And so they did that. And they knew the Sea of Galilee like the palm of their hand. They knew what storms were like. They knew how to get in them and get out of them. They knew all that because that was where they lived their lives. So when the storm comes up and Jesus has to calm the storm and they are afraid, this is not a storm like anything we've seen. This is a hurricane hitting the Sea of Galilee. And there's no way out. So it's bigger than just waves, you know, like that. So that just, yeah. So they did know the languages. If you were in Torah school, you had to learn some of the real Hebrew because that's what Torah was in. You had to learn Aramaic. You had to learn Greek if you were going to run your business because all business was run in Greek. And they might have learned some Latin too, I don't know about that. But I would say that those disciples from Galilee knew at least 3 languages. By the way, I would say Jesus knew at least 5 that I know of. He would have known Hebrew, he would have known Aramaic, he would have known Greek, he would have known Latin, and he would have known Egyptian. He was in Egypt as a child. As a matter of fact, that was the language he learned first growing. So he would have learned at least 5, which...
But that isn't written anywhere, right?
No, but he did grow up he did spend young years in Egypt.
But he could have known many more.
He could have known more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I wish we knew.
I know.
He probably does know everything.
He knows
Otherwise,
all.
Well, I'm talking about I mean, I'm telling you, the more I studied this, I just opened up more questions than I've got answers. My list is getting much longer, yes, yes. The everyday normal people were called the Amharites. That means the people of the earth. So they are called the Amharites. It looks like this in English.
Say commoners, maybe? Everyday people. Yeah. That's
Okay?
commoners.
Amharites. I think there's like maybe a slight break in between right there. Amharites. So that means the people of the land. Eretz right here is land. Okay? Ha is the. Eretz is land. And I didn't check out but Amharites is the people of the land. They had all your basic occupations like we do. They were smiths who worked with metalsmiths. There were fishermen. There were craftsmen. Jesus would have been considered one of the Amharites because he was the carpenter, which could have also been a stonemason if you go back to figuring what that word meant. They had sheep, goats, cattle, depending on if they're higher, a little bit wealthier or not. They lived in that you remember that? The house of the Father? And that had it was kind of done like a circle type courtyard, and there's a house. It's usually a 2-story house, and the people live up here, and the animals live down here. Okay? This has a wall around it, and the kitchen and the oven is outside, and the animals are out here, and the life takes place in here. And very often the entire family, meaning the father, let's just say 3 sons, and his wife, and kids, and same, would all live in the house of the Father. Okay, so maybe there's more rooms, depending on how big the family is, and this is called, that's their family unit. So it's a little bit different than we have it. So there's usually 3 generations in a family unit, and most of the time, they didn't live long enough to become great-grandparents, so you couldn't get to 4 generations, but if there were, that would be where that is. And the wife comes out of her father's home and moves into her husband's father's home. Okay, so she becomes part of the new, over there, the house of the new father. So when someone was a widow and had nobody, they are out here on their own, which is why the law said to take care of orphans and widows. And why doing anything harmful to a widow was really serious, because they had, first of all, women didn't hold down jobs. She had very little way to take care of herself, and if she could not live in the father's house. There was an example of this in way back in Genesis with Jacob and Tamar. So but that's another story. But anyway, that's that. They live like that. They marketplace was where things happened. You go to a little marketplace, and it's like an outdoor market. They still have those in Jerusalem today. They just line the streets and put out your stuff, and probably all of us in the United we go who are germ freaks would just flip out, because the meat is sitting right there. And I'm not saying that it's wrapped, okay? And next to it is whatever and whatever and whatever, and you You just prayed over your food, that's all I gotta say.
The bread, have you seen the
The
bread?
bread was out, yes.
And they'd be wanting you to buy the bread.
Yeah, they'd be
In their hand,
holding
you know.
the bread, not talking wrapped bread, they're holding the bread, and they're often little boys. They're holding the bread and they're trying to get you to buy the bread and it's coming out of their hand. And that means nothing over there. It meant nothing and it's, so we have an entire different way of looking. We're the germaphobes,
Crazy.
they are not, you know? And so, so life went on like that. That's kind of how life was for the average person. Okay? Rabbis were like your local teachers. If someone was going to Torah school, it would be one of the rabbis that would be teaching them in the Torah school. So now I thought I'd tell you about Pharisees. Pharisee comes from the word parash. That's where you get Pharisee. And it means, did I spell that right? No, Pharisee. I forgot something. No, maybe I didn't.
It looks good.
Okay. There's something about spelling on the whiteboard, it just doesn't work. I don't know. It means to separate. So this all began back in the Maccabees. So do you remember on the chart, or if you just remember that I explained that, when the Sadducees started taking over the priesthood, that they kept letting the Greeks influence the stuff, and the Jewish tightness of the law was being stretched all over the place. Well, the Pharisees come in and they go, we're going to protect this. We're going to protect the Torah. We're going to protect our culture. So they became a group that were, a lot of them were of the Haaretz. They weren't necessarily the high people, but they kind of grew up like that, and they believed in the interpretation, the traditional interpretation of Scripture. They were very much into this, knew their laws, knew their details, knew exactly how much cumin to tithe. Now, have you ever worked with cumin? I've worked with cumin. It is like powder. If you had to tithe it, that means you have to weigh this out in the tiniest little bits. And they knew exactly how much to tithe of their cumin. I'm thinking, why bother? But they did that. They believed in the Pharisees believed in the entire Old Testament. So the Old Testament is set up as Tanakh. And it goes like this. A-K-E? No. A-C-H, maybe. Maybe it's A-K-H. You guys, I'm not doing well today with my memory. So the T stands for Torah. And the N stands for, I've got it on here, so I'm going to do it right. The N stands for Nevi'im, and the K, it is a K, stands for Ketuvim. Okay, this is the law. This is the prophets. And this is the writings. They organized their Old Testament, they didn't call it the Old Testament, they organized their scriptures differently than our Old Testament is organized. So their first 5 books would be Genesis through Deuteronomy, but the next books would be prophets. And I would have to go look up and tell you exactly what is the order of the Jewish thing, but it's not necessarily that we need to know it. But this is the T, N, and the K. And in Hebrew, the vowels don't count. Okay? They're not written in the original. And so I'm telling you that the Pharisees believed in all of this. The Sadducees did not. That's why I'm showing it to you. The Sadducees only believe in the top type. Okay, so that makes a difference later on when you say the Sadducees do not believe in life after death. You go, wait a minute. In Daniel, one of his last verses says, and they will live forever, or they will have life everlasting, or something like that. This would be an argument between Pharisees and Sadducees. It's in Daniel. They go, but Daniel doesn't count. It's not inspired. That's how the Sadducees could not believe in eternal life. And so when the Sadducees come to Jesus and say, okay, so this is the Sadducees, by the way, come to Jesus and say, okay, so in the resurrection, guy dies and he marries this girl, and you guys remember the Levite rule where if the husband dies before a child is born, she used to marry his brother to get a son, and she used to keep doing this until she gets a son to carry on the family name. Okay, so they make up this story. The guy dies, so the wife marries the brother. The brother dies, no children. So the wife marries the third brother. The brother dies, no children. And then the wife dies. So when she gets to heaven, whose husband is she? That's a good question. He said, I thought you didn't believe in heaven. So the story makes more sense when you understand what they believe in and what they don't believe in. So the Pharisees believe in all of it, but they also believe in the oral tradition. So if it came down orally that Moses said this or this or this or this, then that was added to Torah, which is why the Pharisees' gods became very legalistic. Their whole initial idea was to protect it. They became very legalistic in doing that. I lost myself. They believed in angels, they believed in demons, they believed in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body, which I knew about the immortality of the soul, I didn't know about the resurrection of the body. But they did believe in all that. By 10 BC, 5 or 6 years before, 4 or 5 years before Jesus is born, there's two main lines of thought. One is called the thought of Hillel, and one is called the thought of the school of Shammai. Anybody watch The Chosen? You seen that? Have you heard the arguments between the Pharisees are going, you're from the school of Hillel and you're from the school of Shammai? That's what this is. Those were real things. And they had, one was a little bit more strict, one was a little bit more liberal, and so they could play each other back and forth to get what they wanted.
Debbie, excuse me, could you speak a little more to your believing in angels? How did that work?
They believed in Gabriel. They believed in the angels who came and talked to Daniel and gave him the dreams, whereas the Sadducees did not. And I would have to look that up for you more about that. So they did believe in that, yeah.
So Debbie,
Yes.
who gave the Pharisees and the Sadducees their power? Or who acknowledged them as?
Okay, so the Sadducees are another group, and they are, the Pharisees sort of gathered themselves as a group to protect Judaism from when the Greeks came in, and I'm having a real mental vein. When the Greeks came in and conquered the land way back and Antiochus Epiphanes and that story, okay? And they're tearing through the land, and especially when he destroyed the temple and he put up the altar in the temple, okay, the Pharisees go, okay, we're not gonna we're going to recover and we're going to protect our religion. And that was a good thing. And then they, like so many good things, it snowballs into more stuff, right? So the Sadducees, on the other hand, were the high priests. that they were broke off from the line of Zadok, which is not, so they were not of the official line of the high priesthood, and they got their power from whoever was the Greek leader that was sent in by the government. Okay, so the Sadducees are in power politically. The Pharisees tend to be in power spiritually, I guess you could say, religiously. That's the conflict between the two. The Sadducees have way more money. And they are not of the Haaretz. They are of the high-ranking aristocracy. So they bribe their way in, or they use extortion to get in. Almost every one of them bribed their way. So they would go to Pilate and say, here, I'm going to give you $1 million, make me high priest. And he would, of course, because he would take the $1 million. So that's the
So
conflict.
Caiaphas is,
A Sadducee. Caiaphas is a Sadducee, so is Annas. And as Caiaphas and Annas, the priests that follow them, are from their family. They sort of get a family dominance over the high priesthood for quite some time. So that's what goes on with them. The Sadducees do not believe in angels, do not believe in spirits, do not believe in life after death, do not believe in heaven, do not believe in anything like that. Once you're dead, you're dead. That's Sadducees. So, that's Caiaphas. All right, scribes. We run across scribes. They are professional copyists, and they are paid for their job. They also become the most intelligently informed experts on the law because they're constantly copying it and reading it. So they were the experts. So when the wise men come to Herod, he goes and checks with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees to say, where is that child supposed to be born? And they know. So they know their Old Testament in and out. The Essenes. The Essenes are a group that are like the Pharisees, only way more than that. So take the Pharisees to the extreme, and you have the Essenes. And what they did was they completely separated themselves out into a community that was disconnected with the rest of society. And that was at Qumran, which is just a little, if this is the Dead Sea, and that's the Jordan River, Qumran's about right there in the hills. Don't you think possibly there, maybe? Okay, that's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, was with Qumran, with this group. And they were the Puritans, they were isolated, they had no interaction, they were completely self-sufficient in their own community. So that's the Essenes. There's another group called the Zealots. The Zealots are a non-religious group, so to speak. They are a militia. And they are developed right around the birth of Christ. And their idea was militarily to be prepared to help Messiah conquer the Romans. So they were experts with their swords and with their daggers, and they were fighting men to the end. So they were, you wouldn't want to run into a zealot in the street if it was night and he was mad at you. The zealots were like that. Okay, so I thought I'd explain to you some about how the diaspora, how it infiltrated both groups. Okay, so the diaspora means dispersion. It's a Greek word. So it means dispersion, and basically what they're talking about is the Jews who are being spread out all over this entire empire. And it starts with way, way, way back in 700 BC when Sargon conquers the northern kingdom. You guys probably remember that part of the story. And he takes those people, all the Jews of the northern kingdom, and he spreads them out all over his kingdom. And he moves them, and his purpose was to destroy their identity and make them a new identity. And Sargon, I think the first or the second, he's the guy who was the king of Assyria who attacked the northern kingdom. And he left a few of the Jewish people in the land, and then he brought in his other conquered people and put them there so that these people would intermix. That's the Samaritans. That's where the Samaritans came from. So they're partially Jewish and partially not. And their culture is partially Jewish and partially not. Because they're right here. So that's where the Samaritans came from. And they come into our story a lot. Okay, so when they go to flip through history a little bit and come to Babylon, now that my left and right's right, the Nebuchadnezzar takes his people to Babylon, right? Do I have the west and east correct? Is this east? That's west for me, so this is east. So, okay, if I'm looking north, okay, so he takes them to Babylon and they become spread out. And then as Alexander the Great comes, he takes them back and spreads them like this. Okay? So Alexander the Great, and he even offered them all kinds of incentives. He goes, if you come live in Corinth, I'm going to give you tax-free for a whole generation or whatever. So he had all kinds of incentives to move the Jewish people all over. Okay? So this is called the dispersion. And everywhere they went, they got absorbed into these people. Or they tried to maintain their identity, one of the two. And that's where they set up all these synagogues too. So it became a very large group. By the time of Christ, it is estimated that there were 4.5 million Jews in the dispersion. Now, in Jerusalem is about 25,000. Okay, so you have about 25,000 in Jerusalem. You have about 4.5 million dispersed. So it's a large group of people dispersed throughout. And like we said before, they have become less and less Jewish and more synchronistic, I guess you would call it, in their viewpoint on life. Let me jump on to the end of here. Oh, I was going to tell you what happened to one guy. Oh, there's two groups. I got to tell you this. So many things. In the dispersion, so we're talking about outside of Jerusalem, okay? Not the ones in Jerusalem, the one outside. There's really two kinds of Jews. There's probably more than that, but Greeks and Hellenists. The ones that really try to stick to it well are called these guys. So like Paul is in a Gentile city and he is very, very, very strong Jewish. So the Hellenistic Greek culture has not influenced him much at all. Otherwise, he could not be a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And then there's the other group of Jewish people who are more Greek. Okay, so you've got both kinds, and we're going to run into both kinds, whether there are the really heavily Jewish stuck to it with ones, or the ones who are just, have, there's those two kinds. One of the guys that was a Hellenist is a guy named Philo. Have you heard of Philo? Okay, there's really two main historians at the time who write about this. And one is Josephus, and one is Philo. So we get about 90% of our information about this from Josephus and about 10% from Philo, just because Philo didn't write a lot about the Jews. He wrote a lot about everything else. And he is Jewish. And he is Jewish from Alexandria. And so he has probably gone through 400 years of Egyptian influence on his family life till he gets down to here. He's still Jewish. This is what it says about him. He's called a Hellenistic Jew from Alexandria, Egypt. He's a historian born around 40 AD, so that's 10 years after Jesus died. Here's his personal belief. He believes God is eternal. He believes he's unchangeable, holy, free, and perfect. But because he is superior, here's where the Greek influence comes in. Because he is superior, he cannot be defined at all. And because he can be not, because if you defined him, you would limit him. And because he can't be defined, he's depersonalized. And because of that, he is more of a deist in his viewpoint. And that is very prominent in Jewish people today.
Wow.
So I was just told you this story because how does the Hellenistic world influence the the Jewish world? That's an example of it right there. And he's one of our main historians on this, one of my two historians on this subject. So now, Josephus wasn't a believer in Jesus Christ either. And he has a lot of Greek influence, but he's a little bit way more on the Jewish side than Philo. Okay, so here's the end of the story of the culture. You've got, pretend it's 30 AD. It's the night before Jesus is going to be crucified. You've got zealots who are ready to fight like you can't believe. You've got Sadducees who will do anything to maintain control. You got Pharisees who have decided that Jesus cannot be the right Messiah, and they are sticking to the law to get rid of him. You've got the disciples there, you've got everything, and everybody wants Messiah to come. And they've got it all wrong. And that night, Jesus is going to present a new strategy. And that's next week. Dear Father,
Wow.
dear Father, I want to thank you for having people like Josephus and Philo record this information for us so that we have an opportunity to get into the life of it all and just feel what it's like to be there, to feel what it would be like to walk outside in Jerusalem and wonder, is the guy what's it like out there? Is there danger in the streets? Is there rebellion in the streets? Is there Jesus in the streets? What's going on? And I just thank you for giving us a way to be in the story and help us to learn a little bit more each time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
So,